Hello, I'm Jason Skill and this is Painting with Skill. Now, if you've been following a number of my videos, you'll have gathered that I'm no longer in my conservatory at home. I'm now in a studio in Newcastle Art Centre. As well as being the premier art shop in the northeast, it also has a number of other facilities. It has a fantastic gallery, which I've exhibited in a number of times, a cafe, a craft shop. It even has its own jazz club. So it's a really vibrant place to be. Now, I hope that this change of location will basically enable us to improve the product, get more light on the subject, and hopefully make a load of better videos for you to follow. In this lesson, what we'll be doing is looking at wet in wet. Now, watercolour painters get really excited with wet in wet. It's a way of painting that it feels free and exciting, and it doesn't feel painstaking and slow. So a lot of people who are learning watercolour get very excited by this. Now, I love wet in wet. It's been one of the methods that I've used extensively in my career. A lot of my seascape paintings are based on that method of wet in wet as the starting point for the pictures. Now, what you need to do with wet in wet really is to learn how to do exciting free stuff with it, but you also need to know how to control what you're doing. So what we'll do is we'll just look at some of those key little things that probably help you control wet in wet. The first one is you need to do it on watercolour paper. Now, this is a sheet of 140-pound knot watercolour paper. Now, I'll go into the differences in watercolour paper and take you around a shop and show you how they would be purchased in book form and in sheets, and that in another video at another point. If you just take it as read at this point, that what you need to do is have a 140-pound, or this may be described as 300 GSM watercolour paper that'll have a slight surface to it. And what you need to do with that is you need to stick it down to the board. Now, assuming that you're going to do an awful lot of experiments, you just need to stick that down to the board with some masking tape. So we're not talking about stretching the paper here, we're just basically holding it down on the board. You need a board which is of a reasonable thickness, so it's not going to be sort of buckling and bending. So a bit of hardboard or thin plywood probably won't do. You need something about, I don't know, 1/8 of an inch thick at least. The other thing that I've done is I don't have the board flat, I have the board on an angle. I actually use this device, which is two pieces of wood, which when one slots into another, that then holds it at about 30 degrees, and then when I place that on there, it holds it nicely in position. So you need to put the tape all the way round the edge. Don't just put it meanly round just the four corners. If you do that, you might find that water goes underneath. It still keeps it wet when you perhaps want to control the moisture level. Now, the paint. If you add the paint and all you have is fluid, so here I'm just going to take some French ultramarine and just adding some water from the water pot. I'm just making this into a thin film of water, a little wash. If all you do is that into a wet surface, you'll find it difficult to get a great deal of control. And a lot of the time, if you're using pans or if your paint has dried hard, as mine has here, you'll find it difficult to make it anything other than a fluid paint. So, to get the most control, what I would do is I'd take some fresh paint and I'd squeeze new paint out. That means that you can then tease that paint at its edge and you'll be able to control it so that you can alter its viscosity, you can change it so it gets a little bit thicker and pastier on your brush when you need it. If all you've got is the dried out paint, you'll only be able to make fluid. So I've put a little bit of the French ultramarine out there. I'll just also squeeze a little bit of sepia into the area where I would normally use sepia. Now, if you notice, I have an area I put this paint in my palette. I haven't just thought, ooh, where's a space? I'll squeeze it anywhere. I've put the blue on top of the blue area, and I only put that blue in that blue area. Again, think and plan ahead when you're doing your palette. Don't just squeeze it any old place, okay? Set out the way that you want to lay out your palette. Now, you need to wet the paper. Now, when you wet the paper, you do that with a wash brush. And again, I'll talk you through different wash brushes. You could use a wash brush or a sponge or various things to wet the paper. I use a quite a large wash brush with a soft hair. Nylon isn't so good because it sometimes can be abrasive to any layers that you've previously put on. So it's a soft hair, and what I'm doing is I'm taking it out the middle of the pot, and I'll just take the excess off on the side, or I'm just stopping it so it's no longer dribbling. Now, I wouldn't do a massive area at once. You might want to start with an area of paper maybe about the size of a generous postcard or a small scale greetings card. So on this sheet, which is just about A4, what I'm going to do is wet this bottom portion of the page. Now I've gone from the top and I've just clipped the edge and come down. I haven't just wet it any old how erratically. So if I just wet that erratically above it and then I look at that from the side, I can see that that area there was dry and that area there was dry. By doing it systematically, you're less likely to leave dry patches. So now let's just look at the idea of adding pure fluid paint. So assume that you're working with the dry caked paint, or that you're just making a fluid wash, and I'll put that into here. Now this illustrates that because I've now got it on a sort of 30-degree angle, it's just going to drain down the board. Now if you're wanting to make it look like it's raining, or you're looking for a sky that has kind of a dramatic feel, or mountains, or whatever you're doing in an area of paint, then draining down the page may be interesting. And it might be fun to mix. So let's look at just taking a little bit of this sepia, and I'm just going to make this into fluid first. So I'm not going to try and make it to a thicker version of that paint. I'm just going to put a little bit of that sepia into the French ultramarine. Let's put a bit more of the French ultramarine into the sepia. So we'll just play with the idea of it tipping down the board. It's just slowly draining, and the paint moving in the direction that you have the board. Now if I move the board so it leant this way, for example, then the paint would lean this way. If I had the board this way, it would lean down this way. So you can maybe play with how you pitch the board to see which direction the paint flows. I might think, if I'm losing control of it, I might use a bit of kitchen roll here. I might take up the excess from, say, the edges so it doesn't push back, maybe at the bottom. And I would just have some fun initially with wetting the paper and then wetting it with wet paint. So, and that really is sort of working on this description of wet in wet. So it's a wet paper and wet paint, and it flows. So if you have a very wet surface, it will flow quite quickly. If you have an only slightly damp surface, it will flow a little bit more slowly. Now, to control the speed of the flow of that paint, what you'd have to do is to wet the paper quite carefully. So I'm going to use this top left-hand portion of the piece of paper here. And then I'm going to go back in, and this time, instead of going down into the pooled wet paint, I'm going to go just into a little bit thicker blue paint and maybe a little bit thicker brown paint. I might even try to get rid of some of the excess of moisture, either rubbing it off the side of the palette, or I might just touch it and take the excess off on a bit of kitchen roll. So I'm trying to take the moisture down a bit here. Now in this surface, the top will dry out faster. So if I put the paint now in the top, this is just damp now at the top because the lights are speeding up the drying time. Right. Now instead of it running down the page, even if I put it into a wetter area, it'll move a little bit, but at nowhere near the same speed and rate as it does when the paper is more wet. So what you find is that you'll have two things that you need to think about when you're doing wet and wet. Firstly, how damp is, well, let's say three probably. How damp is the paper? How damp is the brush? And how warm is the room? So if it's very hot, the stuff will dry faster, and if it's cold, you might get a little bit longer to do some of your wet and wet experiments. So sometimes when I was doing the seascapes, I actually used to open the doors of my studio and make the studio very cold so that I could do some of the painting process and knew it wouldn't dry quickly. On other occasions, you might want to keep the place pretty warm because you want it to dry out and put further layers on. So because this is now just not as wet damp, the surface of the paper, I'm watching the surface of the paper. Is that going from being sort of a shiny wet look that might be reflecting a little bit for the canvas here, or whether it's looking dull? So you're looking whether if it's shiny, it will move faster, and if it's dull, it will be hardly moving at all. Now, why would you want to be able to control it to a higher degree rather than it just running down the page? Well, let's imagine that we wet this area here and we're going to paint a little bit of hillside and a little bit of sky. So I've wet that, and then I'm thinking, well, I might start by making it look like it slightly runs down. So here we go, putting some paint in, and away it shifts. It's coming down the page. It's like the first thing we did. It was wet, it's fluid. Now I'm thinking, I could do a little bit of land. I'll just make that a tiny bit less damp. So let's go for a little bit less damp here. So now it sort of appears a little bit like this is kind of a wet sky. And I'm putting this paint in. It's still going to blend. Now I want to maybe make the sky a little bit darker, but maybe I want to add some weight to it. Now if I add a lot of fluid into this, it might just run down a bit. So I want to do is take some of the excess off my brush, a little bit of the excess off on the palette. So I'm just keeping that down, this level down. I just feel like I could do with a bit of a heavier looking cloud. Let's make that a tiny bit more blue into this. So this, now this isn't moving very fast, so the cloud of which the rain seems to be coming out of is perhaps a little bit darker at the top of the picture. Now it comes to here, I might think, well actually in the foreground I want this to be a little bit heavier, so I'm adding a little bit more weight to the paint and I'm putting that in the foreground. Now do you see how it's not really moved to any great degree? It sort of stayed almost where I put it. Now I'm going to put some little tree type stuff on. So now I'm putting the paint in and I'm just letting it move a bit. So I'll have some tree type marks up here on the hillside. That bit there, it might drain down a bit more. And then let's have that bit. So always work with an accident. Happy accidents, as artists like to call it. If it works, leave it. Okay. So now I'm putting a few little other tree type marks in, maybe a few little bits sideways. So I'm using that lovely fuzziness that you get with wet and wet. And more. Now I'm going to dry it down a little bit more. So it's going from being sort of shiny wet to a little bit more dull, and I'm only putting a small amount of moisture on my brush. So let's put a little bit there for another bit of trees. I've got another tree here. Now it's getting a little bit more control. So if I just go sideways, it's fuzzing out into that shape. Make that a bit darker. So, just as an idea that what you're trying to do is you're trying to control how the paint flows. One of the easiest ways to do this is to perhaps look at that stock sky methodology that we were looking at in some of the previous videos, and just practice that shape over and over again using the wet in wet, so that not only can you replicate it using wet on dry as previously illustrated, you can do it by doing the wet in wet. You wet the paper and you follow that format of sky shape so that you're working over and over. The key bit with watercolor painting with wet in wet is to get a real grip on how, and basically watching paint dry. That is kind of funny as it sounds, that is sort of what you have to learn to do. You sort of have to learn to watch the paper dry. You learn to watch how dry or moist the paint is in the palette. You're thinking or noticing how damp the paint is in the brush. And that's what gives you, with the experience of it, the ability to make things that look, the kind of soft focus that you're looking for, whether you're wanting to run and make it look exciting, or you're wanting to slightly hold it down in a more controlled way. Now, wet in wet isn't just necessarily a term that could be associated with just wetting a big area and then wetting it. In a way, if I take a little bit of faint colour here and I wet, say, an area like a leaf shape there, and then I decide to make, let's just use the same sort of colours, I'll make this end a little bit more blue into that shape, and then Imagine I come down and do kind of a central stalk to it, like its spine, and maybe do some other little spinal bits that come out from its sides. This is still wet in wet. I'm doing that within that shape. So the wet in wet doesn't have to be like the whole sheet or one big section of the sheet. It could be referred to as that you've approached a smaller area using wet in wet. Okay, so that's the basics of wet in wet. You need to stick the paper down, whether you're stretching it in the correct by wetting it and letting it expand and holding it down with gum strip, or you're just holding it down with the tape. I would recommend at first you just did it with the tape, because basically it's an awful lot of faff to do the stretching for what may be just a series of early experiments. You're then making sure that you have the right kind of paint available. Do you need it freshly, just put my teeth in, freshly squeezed out, right? Or do you want to be just using dried paint? And then how do you wet the paper? Are you wetting it evenly, or are you, just putting it on with lots of water going everywhere? So try to keep it even and controlled. Learning to control wet and wet is about watching moisture levels of things. Okay. In the next episode, what we'll do is I'll look at taking the wet and wet and starting to use the kitchen roll as a creative tool. So we'll look again at that sky format, the stock sky format, and I'll show you various ways that you can manipulate the kitchen roll to pull that together. And then in the video that follows that, we'll pull it all together, this idea of making land and sky and things, and make a little landscape for you, putting all those skills together.